Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the International Labor Organization doing in conjunction with the United Nations, the Group of 20, and many other groups to reduce poverty and to promote employment opportunities, especially for young people? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Poverty and youth unemployment are major challenges in many areas around the world. Today we're going to take a look at one United Nations agency, the International Labor Organization, and talk about what it's doing in conjunction with a lot of other folks to really focus on these problems and to coordinate principles and policies to help overcome them. My guest is an expert on the ILO. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey. Mr. Pursey of the United Kingdom is Director of the Department for Multilateral Cooperation of the International Labor Organization. Mr. Stephen Pursey, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Pleased to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's get right into it. You work with the International Labor Organization. It came basically out of the ruins of World War I in 1919. It's the third oldest specialized agency in the UN system. What is your major mission and how did it really come into being in 1919?
I think the simplest way to describe it is its mission is social justice. But social justice was pursued particularly through the promotion of what we call decent work, and that's work in dignity, free from poverty, security, absence of discrimination. Yes, it's very interesting. We're coming up to our 100th anniversary, and in many ways the period before the First World War was the first globalization, and the sort of industrialization that was dominated the 19th and early 20th century was very cruel, very inhumane, and a lot of people saw it as part of the origins, the social underpinnings of what caused eventually the war. So after the war there was a very strong effort to build, if you like, peace and harmony through social justice, and remarkably the governments of that time at the Treaty of at Versailles, when they formed the ILO as part of the League of Nations, felt that the only way to build the coordinated action needed to build social justice was not just with governments. Each member state of the ILO is represented also by an employer organization and by a trade union. So that's what we call tripartism. Our symbol is three keys, and it's played a major role again in the post-Second World War period for very similar reasons.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned tripartite. Though you have a stool, a three-legged stool. Go back again to those three legs and how they work together to make sure that the stool doesn't fall over in one direction or the other.
Well, the workplace, workplaces all over the world, basically government is in the background. It's the worker and the employer, the manager, who are organizing work, organizing how people are paid, what vacation and leave time they have, whether the conditions are safe. But of course, workplaces are not just regulated by the employers and the workers through their trade unions. There are also laws. So it's these three elements that are all at play in determining whether workplaces are safe, secure, and work is rewarding and productive. So that's, if you like, the underlying logic of it. It works out in the ILO. When you go to our conference, you see behind each country flag there are 4 seats, 2 for the government and 1 each for an employer and a worker.
Exactly. And it's critical to have all the players at the table. If 2 of the 3 decided to develop the policies and impose them on the third party, it just would not work.
Exactly. There's a very strong ethos, if you like, a very strong working practice in the ILO to avoid marginalizing one of the parties. It sometimes means that the discussions go on long and hard as to get everybody on board and find the formulas that that enable you to work forward. But once we do get agreements, they stick pretty solidly. So we now have around 200 different international standards. We call them conventions, which are the principles upon which governments draw when they legislate in the area of labour. And those are all developed through this tripartite process.
Now, you're the head of the Department of Multilateral Cooperation. What exactly does that department do?
Well, I think we do 2 or 3 different things. One is that we try to make sure that the messages, the advice, the information, the analysis that the ILO is generating is communicated to our partners in the multilateral system. First of all, the UN, of which we're part, but also the Bretton Woods institutions, and also bodies like the G20, which it works hard to try and avoid calling itself an organization, but it is a multilateral institution, if you like. But secondly, we're also listening to what's going on in the other agencies and making sure that we can communicate that back into the ILO and that people are aware of what's going on in different places. We have quite close collaboration with the Food and Agriculture Organization, for example. And then the third and an increasingly important part is, of course, where we have UN teams in countries. When the ILO is part of a UN team, it's making sure that we are equipping our representatives in the UN teams to play a full part in helping the country to develop their strategies going forward. And I think with the new Sustainable Development Goals, that's going to be really important.
You mentioned the group of 20. What exactly, don't go through all 20 of them, but what are some of the countries in the group of 20, and what is their basic purpose or mission?
Yeah, the group of 20 was originally put together after the Asian financial crisis and was meeting at the level of finance ministers. And it came together because of the realization that this financial crisis in Asia, to solve it, you had to have, for a start, the big economic powers in Asia on board: China, India, Indonesia, as well as if you like, the older industrial powers of the United States, the European countries, and Japan. In 2008, when this global financial crisis hit, President Bush called the group together at the level of the heads of state, and the 20-odd countries, because it's not quite 20 actually, that sit around the table represent something like 85% of world GDP and about 65% of world population. So you're really talking about 20 seats at the table where you've got a reasonable chance of being able to coordinate what's happening. And I suppose, simply put, its role is to try and make sure that, economically speaking, the whole is more than the sum of the parts.
Exactly. And it's so important to bring these players together. You mentioned the financial problems. We had the deep recession, not almost a depression. It started, I guess, in 2008, primarily because of financial miscalculations of the housing and the financial institutions in the United States, but it reverberated around the world. How devastating has that been, and what has the recovery been like over the past several years as far as coming out of this deep recession to get back to a more normal level of unemployment rates and things like that?
Well, I think the G20 had an initial success in that it prevented a Great Depression again. However, we did have a great recession. World growth slowed dramatically in 2009 and 2010. Started to pick up a little bit since then, but it's been rather shallow and rather uneven. And from a jobs point of view, we feel that, for example, in the G20, we're still 60 million jobs short of what we would have had the growth patterns pre-crisis continued. That's about 30 million people who are outright unemployed, an increase in the total amount of unemployment, and another 30 million odd who've given up the search for jobs that just aren't there. So the impact has been very strong worldwide. In a sense, the growth rates of the advanced countries went down to near zero, 1-2%. Emerging countries were growing faster, but they fell down. The problem for the emerging countries is that they need to grow fast because they've got a growing population in many cases, certainly a growing working age population. So they sort of have to run to stand still. And if you slow down when you're running to stand still, you might come to a stop.
Exactly, right. They do have very unique challenges that many other countries do not have, and of course that's a problem they need to focus upon. When I think about this whole situation, the financial situation, I often think of globalization. We hear globalization as it's a term that's thrown out there. I guess if we had 2 more people in the room, we'd have 4 different opinions of globalization. How do you view that term, and how does it impact what you're doing with the International Labor Organization?
Well, I think the main thing is that economies are interdependent. When the ILO was first founded, certainly up until sometime around the mid-70s, 80s, a large part of the management of the economy was in the hands of the government. The marketplace and the economic instruments of government were the same as the boundaries of the country. These days, that's not the case. The trade, the financial flows are interconnected, and that means the jobs are interconnected as well. So I think, first of all, it's the steady growth of an almost single global market. Some people attach this also to technology and see technology as part of globalization. And yes, there's a case for that. Personally, I think that you need to separate them out a little bit. So yeah, I think globalization is, for me, it's the interconnectedness of the economies, and the fact that we have to change the government institutions and the way that the multilateral system functions in order to get more cooperation between governments to manage the global economy.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to look at some of our previous shows, to comment on them, to also make suggestions for future topics and future guests. Today, we're looking at the International Labor Organization and what it's doing, working with a wide range of partners around the world to reduce poverty and also to create employment opportunities, especially for young people. My guest today is an expert on the International Labor Organization. My guest today is Mr. Stephen Pursey of the United Kingdom, who is the Director of the Department for Multilateral Cooperation of the International Labor Organization. Mr. Pursey, we're talking about this situation with your office and multilateral cooperation. How would you, let's just take unemployed youth, which is really a powder keg in many areas, as you just alluded to a minute ago. How would you bring together, how would you get the information out and to coordinate practices and principles with, say, the Group of 20 or with the the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development or the Organization of American States or African Union, whatever it might be. But how would you work to do that?
Well, first of all, we share our analysis, our information. There's a lot of cooperation goes on between the different institutions. You have experts who like to talk to each other. So there's a lot of, if you like, collaboration at that level. But then we're at the service of governments. We're trying to help governments work out what the best policies are. So a certain amount of it is exchanging information about good practices, what's been working, what hasn't been working in different parts of the world. Not that you can export any one country's policies and expect it to work magically in another country. They have to be tuned and adapted. But it's important for countries to learn from each other. That's a big part of what's going on. But the final stage, the really important stage, which we were just talking about, is that if economies are interconnected, policies have to be interconnected too. So we have something like 45 million annual increase in the world's workforce. A lot of young people, principally from Africa and South Asia, coming onto the labor market. Most of those young women and men at the moment are finding jobs in the informal economy, which means that they're not likely to be able to escape the risk of poverty, if not absolutely be trapped in poverty. The jobs will be insecure. They probably don't have any health care insurance. As you were saying, this is a real putting dry kindling onto a fire, and we really need to get together to work on this. The G20 is worried about it. They're very keen to get these high levels of non-participation of youth down, and the UN itself. The Secretary General this is one of his major worries, we know, and he's called upon the ILO together with half a dozen other agencies who are able to contribute to a UN system-wide effort to tackle the problems of youth unemployment and youth job creation. The principal way, of course, will be the advice that we collectively give in countries. So we're really looking to pull together the best knowledge that we have of policies to tackle youth unemployment and make it available to the different countries.
How important is it for countries to have safety nets? I know that we hear a lot about safety nets, be it unemployment insurance, retirement, whatever, 401ks, whatever it might be. How important is it for the countries to improve their safety nets so that you can have what I know the International Labor Organization refers to as decent work? How does that tie into that?
Well, I think what we're finding around the world is that countries are more and more interested in building up what we call a social protection floor. We had a very interesting discussion a couple of years ago at the ILO, which generated a recommendation on social protection floors. And we've done some calculations, and we find that for a relatively modest amount of GDP, between 2 to 4%, even the poorest countries can start to build up these elements of social protection. As you say, there's a basic old age pension, some health insurance. If you can't manage unemployment insurance, maybe you can build these sorts of programs for employment intensive investment, which help unemployed people to get some earnings. These basic, also for cash benefits for children. What happens here is that you're improving the nutrition levels, you're improving school attendance. In the end, it pays off in terms of productivity in the economy, and it gets some purchasing power moving. So small enterprises have the chance to get going in the local communities where you're beginning to tackle the underlying problems of debilitating poverty. We feel it's quite important for the international community to give some help to the least developed countries to get these sorts of social protection floors going. But if you look around the middle income countries, a lot of them are raising the floors on their own account now. China has a huge program of extending social protection systems to its rural populations. Just an aside, 100 years ago, Norway was a very poor country. And Norway believes that one of the reasons it's a rich country today is because it started investing in social protection systems 100 years ago.
Exactly. And we think back to really the turn of the century. In the middle part of the 20th century, we saw that the labor unions came online in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they played a critical role, did they not, as far as getting the 40-hour work week, the 8-hour day, a raise in pay, creating really a vibrant middle class that was economically productive, but also was economically a consumer of the goods and services. And today, it seems like we're trying to, especially in the United States, I can't say around the world, to really weaken the labor movement and to try to take away a lot of the power that they have, especially the purchasing power. And a lot of that's done through laws through the United States Congress and groups like that. But how important would labor unions be and the right to bargain collectively and to assemble to talk about work-related issues?
Well, I think it's tremendously important that working people have a voice, and the hard reality is that individual workers on their own don't have much voice. So collective voice through trade unions is the way that you get your problems heard. And number one is to get your problems heard. Number two is to get into negotiations and get them solved. But if you can't get them heard, then they get suppressed, and the problems don't go away. They just burst out in all sorts of other ways, often in very socially disruptive ways. So, I think it's tremendously important to have the possibility, the freedom of associations, we call it, the freedom to get together, to organize without interference. For workers, it's also important for employers, incidentally. Our convention applies to employers too, so that you get this organization going. A lot of things have changed from the period when, for example, in the United States, when collective bargaining and unions really emerged. At that time, you had very big industrial plants. It was often very hard to organize, for example, a big auto plant. But once you got it organized, there were 5,000 members there, which you could, service and bargain for. Now you have maybe 1,000 5-person units. Much, much harder for unions to organize. Furthermore, you have rapid turnover of workforces. Again, very hard to keep people in touch. So that it's a much more challenging world for unions to organize in. And at the same time, some of the laws have made it harder rather than easier to get organized. At the ILO, our employers, along with the trade unions and the government, are pledged to promote the right to freedom of association, the right to organize, the right to be able to get recognition for bargaining purposes. Basically, it's the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Churchill, he had the phrase applied to the United Nations. Better jaw than war. Well, the same thing applies in industrial relations. Better to talk and solve problems, and to do that, you've got to get organized.
And that's a good rule of thumb for countries that are in arguments with one another, or inter-battles or intra-state battles too.
Absolutely.
So they can talk to one another, because if they don't, they will never ever reach a logical conclusion, and one that's amicable to both parties, or all three or four, however many is involved.
One interesting fact is, if you know, a lot of concern these days about inequality. If you look at the countries that have a narrower distribution of income, less inequality, they're often countries which have a high level of collective bargaining coverage. So unions have been really important at narrowing gaps. They've been very important to narrowing pay gaps for women as well. So, you know, it's a challenge. It's a very challenging time for all sorts of reasons for unions. But I think we'd be very sorry if they were eliminated.
Exactly. You mentioned women too. The United Nations Millennium Development Goals, 8 logical quantifiable goals that were developed in 2000 and will run through 2015. Goal number 3 was to empower women. The new Sustainable Development Goals also will focus on women. How important is it to bring women into the mix, into the workforce, into the collective bargaining process, into the whole discussion, and to make them equal partners?
Oh, it's very important, and in the last couple of years, I think it hasn't just been the ILO that started to argue that we need to do more to promote gender equality. The International Monetary Fund has produced some very interesting research which shows the loss to our collective GDP, our national wealth, that comes from having much lower participation rates of women in the workforce. There are many aspects to this. Having laws that prevent discrimination is important. But on the positive side, some of our analysis shows is that the big gaps tend to open up during the period of raising children and raising families. Sometimes we call it the motherhood gap, because when we look at what happens to female participation and even female pay, it's more or less tracking with male pay in the 20s, but during the late 20s through the 30s, it falls off. And this is, of course, because childcare is still often seen as a woman's role. It ought to be a joint role, but making sure that there's affordable, easy, accessible childcare for preschool years, really important. And in the same way, elder care. Again, women are very often in a position of having to look after aging relatives. So I think if there was really one focus point that's coming in, it's really looking at how we deal with the problem, as we call it, of workers with family responsibilities. We have to get that balance much better in the interests of employers and in the interests of workers. Exactly.
Now, as you look over the horizon and look at the current situations, what the challenges are, what do you see as 2 or 3 of the major, challenges you're going to be dealing with as the International Labor Organization, as the United Nations, is working with the 3 members of the tripart members of the ILO to move forward as we get into the 21st century?
You know, well, you mentioned the MDGs, and certainly a lot of progress is made. Extreme poverty, and we are talking about really extreme poverty, has been pretty much halved during the period of the MDGs, but there's still a long way to go. I mentioned earlier that the global labour force is growing by, at the present time, about 45 million a year. That's gradually coming down. But if we think about, first of all, how to make sure we have enough jobs for the new entrants, that we start to reduce unemployment, that we increase female participation, we very quickly get to a number of around about 600 million jobs that we need by 2030, on a steadily, year by year. That's a huge challenge, but if we may say, well, you're dreaming. But we have to dream, because if we don't do this, we're going to be in huge problems. So that would be my major challenge for the period ahead.
Exactly. Well, Mr. Stephen Pursey with the International Labor Organization, you're dealing with some major issues, and I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for joining us today on Global Connections Television.